All right, welcome to the first segment on plants. We're going to be talking about land plants, and there's going to be a series of mini lectures or segments which cover two chapters. So this is the first chapter regarding land plants. So we're going to discuss some general characteristics of land plants as a whole. So all of these characteristics are characteristics that all plants have, even those plants that have seeds that we'll be discussing in the next from the beginning. Remember, Earth was devoid of life at some point, right? So there was no life on Earth, but eventually we had the evolution of bacteria, and then of course cyanobacteria are kind of important regarding plants because cyanobacteria can photosynthesize. So cyanobacteria and algae, remember algae are the protists, which we discussed in the last chapter, evolved about 1.2 to 1.5, this is billion years ago, so more than a billion years ago they evolved. Now a whole lot of time passed by before multicellular organisms evolved, and plants are multicellular organisms. So it was about 500 million years ago where small plants, and then at the same time fungi and animals started to evolve. Now, since colonizing land, plants have diversified into over 200, almost 300,000 species that are currently living today. Now, there are some extinct species, but of course, new ones arise. And we talked a little bit about how species arise and those certain mechanisms that occur in plants. Remember polyploidy. Now, most plants today live on land. So all, plants had started out in water, right? So remember the protists have flagellated sperm, and many of them, they live in marine or some sort of aquatic habitat. Now, some plants had evolved to live on land, but then they went back to an aquatic habitat. So we'll see some examples. Now, plants are kind of important, right? So they supply a whole lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. Now, it's not only plants that supply our oxygen. Algae actually have a larger part in supplying oxygen than plants actually do. However, plants and algae, or the evolution of organisms that can photosynthesize, had changed the atmosphere of the Earth because it increased the oxygen in the atmosphere and, of course, decreased the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because, remember, they can fix the carbon from carbon dioxide. That's part of the whole process of photosynthesis. Remember the Calvin cycle. Plants they supply oxygen, but more importantly, they provide a food source for a lot of organisms, especially the animals. Let's talk about evidence of plants and these characteristics that we talk about. So remember, the closest relative of plants are the green algae, specifically the charophytes. So remember, there's two types of green algae from the protist chapter. There is the chlorophytes and the charophytes. And it's the charophytes that were shown as sister group to the land plants. Okay, so plants have a common ancestor with the charophytes. Now, there's many key traits of plants that also appear in some algae. However, there are key traits that are only found in the charophytes specifically, and this is the evidence that leads us to believe that the charophytes are basically what land plants kind of evolved from, or they have the closest ancestor. And these three traits are the following. We have rings of cellulose synthesizing proteins. So what does that mean? Cellulose synthesizing, right? So that means that cellulose is being produced, and it makes up the cell wall of plants. And of course, you need proteins that produce the cellulose, okay? And then they form in rings just during the process of synthesizing the cellulose. The structure of the flagellated sperm is very similar between the charophytes and the current land plants. And also formation of the phragmoplast. So remember cell division in plants? Remember what forms that cell plate? Remember the cell plate is basically a collection of vesicles, cell or plasma membrane vesicles, right? So they're going to collect in between the two nuclei. Well, how do they get there? It's a series of microtubules, very similar to the cytoskeleton in animals or animal cells, but it's a whole system which allows these vesicles to transport or move to the center of the cell or in between the two nuclei and form that cell plate. So let's look at some examples of the charophytes. So the evidence as a number of, we talked about the characteristics of it, but additional evidence was obtained from nuclear DNA comparisons, chloroplast DNA comparisons, and mitochondrial DNA comparisons. So we know that the charophytes are the closest living relative of plants based on all of this evidence and those three characteristics that I just talked about on the last slide. They are actually still aquatic. Okay, so here we can see a couple examples. They look like plants, right? And but they live in water. They're not land plants. Again, they're just the closest living relatives, and they're protist. Now, there are some adaptations that were required to occur to allow plants to be able to survive on land. Now, think about it, on land versus water. What's the difference, right? So on land, it's a little bit drier, right? So, and then of course on land, you don't have the water helping with the force of gravity. Okay, so they must be able to stand against the force of gravity. Now, one of these things which allowed them to keep from drying out on land is sporopollenin. Sporopollenin is it's a very strong polymer, which basically protects the zygotes from drying out. Okay, so it keeps them from drying out on land. Now, land provided several benefits, and then of course there are drawbacks. Like I said, it's on land it's drier, right? Because there's no water. Well, they're not living in water. Land provided unfiltered sunlight. So in water, right? So think about it. The plants or the algae that are underwater, the water kind of filters out some of the sunlight. It's not really direct sunlight. Well, on land, there's direct sunlight. So, of course, that's going to contribute to more efficient photosynthesis processes. And then on land, right, so you don't have the water. There is carbon dioxide in water. However, there's not as much carbon dioxide in water as there is in, of course, the atmosphere. So there's more carbon dioxide in the air, right, on land. Again, contributing to more efficient photosynthesis processes. And then in the soil, so if they're floating around in water, there's not as much nutrients as there are in the soil. So remember, you have dead organic matter, you have nitrogen in the soil, you have a lot of nutrients that they can utilize in the soil. Okay, so and why is this even a factor, right? So remember, things on land, the plants on land, they're kind of embedded somehow in the soil. So they have to be in some sort of relationship with the soil. And we'll see some examples of that as we go through. Now, there are some challenges that land presented, and I already mentioned one of them. Okay, so less water, right? So plants need water. Okay, so they need to be able to obtain water in some manner if they're not living in water. And then, of course, the force of gravity, right? So they need some more structural support to basically survive from that force of gravity. So let's look at a base tree here. So this kind of shows the relationship between the protists and the plants. So we have the red algae, and then we have the green algae, the chlorophytes specifically, and then the charophytes, which are closest relatives. And then we saw specific examples of charophytes, of course, the ones that are really the direct relative on a couple slides ago. Right, so we've got the closest charophyte relative of what's called the embryophytes. So land plants are called embryophytes. We're going to talk about why they're called embryophytes. Okay. Now, the boundary that divides basically plants from the algae is still under scrutiny, right? So it's still not defined good enough, and we don't know enough information yet. However, this is the relationship that we're going with now. Now, the embryophytes or the land plants are called embryophytes because they are plants that have embryos. Okay, so they have specific tissues. They have like parental tissue and embryonic tissue, and there's a relationship between them which allows transfer of nutrients to the embryo. Okay, so that's why they're called the embryophytes. So let's talk about some traits of plants. So these are derived, of course, they're specific to plants, right? So these are traits that the algae do not have. Well, to this degree. All right. So there's 5 key traits that occur in almost all plants, but they're not present in the charophytes. Okay. So we have the alternation of generations. So you saw the alternation of generations in some of the protists. However, they're not in the charophytes do not have an alternation of generations. Multicellular dependent embryos. Okay, so like I said, they're called the embryophytes. They have embryos, and they're multicellular embryos, which are dependent on the maternal tissue. They have spores that have a wall. Okay, and remember the spore pollen that I mentioned, right? So that protective covering, that's what makes up the wall of the spores, which protects it from drying out. These are going to be produced in structures called the sporangia. They have multicellular gametangia. So we have sporangia and gametangia. So if the spores are made in the sporangia, then you can imagine that gametes are made in the gametangia. They have apical meristems. So you might have remembered from General Biology 1, you were to look at an onion root for different stages of mitosis. You looked in the region, the meristematic region of the onion root. So that would be the root meristem. Okay, so as you can kind of imagine, we'll see this later on. I'm going to describe it a little bit more and we'll see some examples. The meristematic region is the region where growth occurs, right? So that's where plants, specifically, since we're talking about plants, that's where the plants start to grow in length. All right, so let's look at the alternation of generations. So this is the general alternation of generations of a fern. So this shows the sporophyte of the fern. So let's go ahead and start with, we'll kind of start with the sporophyte. So the sporophyte is going to produce the spores. Okay, the spores are produced by meiosis. Okay, so the sporophyte is diploid, and in order to produce haploid spores, of course, meiosis must occur. So this is the kind of the way you want to look at it. Okay, so we know the sporophyte is diploid, so in order to produce haploid cells, or spores in this case, meiosis must occur. So you should remember meiosis from General Biology 1. So the spores are going to be released, okay, and they're haploid, so they're part of the haploid generation, which is the gametophyte generation. Now those are going to be released and they're going to land somewhere and they're going to germinate. They're going to germinate and start developing into a multicellular structure called the gametophyte. Now, in order to do that, they must undergo mitosis because they're already haploid. If you're creating a haploid multicellular structure, you're going to undergo mitosis. You can't undergo meiosis again. So you want to kind of think of it in terms of haploid and diploid to determine what process is occurring in order to develop the next structure. All right, so now we've got mitosis. Mitosis is going to generate the gametes. Right? So you might not think of it that way from what you learned in General Biology 1. But here, we've got a haploid structure producing the gametes. A haploid structure cannot undergo meiosis. It's not going to happen, right? So mitosis generates the gametes. And then the gametes are going to be fertilized when they fuse together. So they're going to undergo fertilization. And then this produces a diploid zygote, which undergoes mitosis to produce the multicellular sporophyte, which is diploid. So this is a general life cycle of plants in general. We're going to see some specific ones in just a moment. Okay, so this shows the general life cycle of a let's look at the moss first. Okay, so this shows the entire life cycle of a moss. So we're going to do this in little sections. This looks a little bit busy. You can see I've colored these a lighter bluish color and a lighter pinkish color, showing the male and the female structures. Here we have the capsule. Okay, so moss have a capsule, it's called, okay, and this is part of the sporophyte. The sporophyte, remember, produces the spores, okay, so there's cells in there called sporocytes, which are going to undergo meiosis. Remember, the sporophyte is diploid. It produces haploid spores, okay, so the spores are part of the gametophyte stage, right? So the spores are going to be released, and then they start to germinate. Okay, so they create these proto-nemata, and then buds will kind of generate off of the proto-nemata, which will eventually develop into the gametophytes. Now, here, this is an organism that can produce male or female gametophytes. Okay, so this would be a male gametophyte, and this would be a female gametophyte. Now, moss have what's called rhizoids. They don't have true roots, and that's what makes them a true moss, because they don't have true roots. And then there are other characteristics which we'll go over in the next segment. However, rhizoids serve as roots, so they're like I guess rudimentary roots. Okay, so that helps kind of anchor them into the ground. Okay, so we have the male and female gametophyte. Well, inside the male and female or part of them, we have what's called the antheridia and the archegonia. Okay, so the antheridium is going to be the male gametophyte, which is going to produce the sperm. The archegonium is going to be the female, which produces the egg. Okay, so you can see the eggs in there. You'll be able to look at these under the microscope in the lab section. Now, what happens is, well, it's important to know that water is required for moss, okay? And water is required for moss because the sperm have flagella. Okay, so the sperm have flagella, so they need water to be able to swim. Because the sperm leave the antheridia, and then they go find the egg in the okay, so you can see the sperm are leaving, they find the egg in the archegonium. So fertilization occurs in the female gametophyte. Okay, so fertilization occurs when the sperm fertilizes the egg. Okay, and again, this occurs within the archegonium, which is the female gametophyte. Okay. After that, of course, after fertilization, a zygote develops. Again, this occurs in the archegonium, or the female gametophyte. Okay, so now we have a diploid egg, which mitosis to produce the sporophyte. So this zygote develops into an embryo, and the embryo develops into the sporophyte. And the sporophyte is going to emerge out of the gametophyte. So this green part is the gametophyte. And then it's going to develop into these mature sporophytes, right? So this is the sporophyte, and it has a foot, which is basically attaches it to the gametophyte. It has the setae, which is like a stem, and then the capsule, which is the sporangium. This is where the spores are produced. Okay, so that's where we started with this life cycle. Okay, so it's important to know that, and we'll kind of point this out in the next segment, that you can see the gametophyte is dominant to the sporophyte. It's much larger, okay, and it lasts longer in these types of plants. All right, so this shows the whole life cycle that I just went over. For example, we'll look at the fern. Okay, so the fern is a little bit different. Now, it's the sporophyte that's dominant in the fern. Okay, so the gametophyte eventually becomes absent, and then the sporophyte is dominant. And the sporophyte, of course, produces the spores. So let's all right. So let's look at the sporophyte. The sporophyte is very large, okay, and it has these leaves on it called fronds. And on the underside of the leaves, we have these little spherical structures that are bright yellow or orangish in color. Those are called sori. Here's one, sorus. So S-O-R-U-S is the singular form of it. Sori, S-O-R-I, is the plural form. So when you talk about multiple sorus, right, you say sori. Now, in each sorus, there are sporangia. Okay, so sporangium is the singular, sporangia is the plural. Okay, so if we look at one sporangium, this is what it looks like. Okay, so it's this big, it's like a mini capsule. Inside that is where the spores are going to be. Now in your lab, it asks you to, you're not going to actually perform this, however, it asks you to basically to put water on it. So the water can allow these sporangia to open up. And when they open up, they release. Okay, so the spores will pop open and then release the spores. And again, this is a diploid structure, so in order to produce the spores, meiosis must occur. Okay, so remember the spores are haploid, they belong to the gametophyte stage. Okay, so the spore is going to be the same idea, right? So it lands somewhere, it's going to germinate, and it starts to develop into a multicellular haploid structure called the gametophyte. And here we can see the rhizoids forming. All right, so in fern, this gametophyte can produce male and female. So it's not separate male and female gametophytes. Okay, this one gametophyte can produce male and which are going to develop, which are basically where the sperm and the egg are going to be developed. So within this single gametophyte, we have the antheridia, which are the male gametophytes. And then we have the archegonia, which are the female gametophyte. Again, this is all in one structure. Then, of course, just like in the moss, the sperm have flagella, so they need water in order to swim and find the egg. They're going to find the egg, and again, it's in the female, well, within the archegonium that's once fertilization occurs, the zygote will develop by mitosis into the sporophyte. Okay, so this is a young sporophyte, but then the gametophyte starts to disappear, and this shows the mature sporophyte. So again, in fern, the sporophytes are more dominant to the gametophytes. So there's this general trend that occurs and we'll notice that as we go through these major. All right, so let's talk about the multicellular dependent embryos. So the embryo is diploid. Okay, so remember this occurs after fertilization, and it's retained within the tissue of the female gametophyte. Okay, so remember, fertilization occurs in the female gametophyte. So now we have maternal tissue, right, and surrounding the embryo. So the embryo is dependent on the maternal tissue for nutrients. And how does the embryo get these nutrients? It gets these nutrients through what's called the placental transfer cells. Okay, so placental transfer cell, right, so we can see this right here. This represents a cell. And then we have these walled ingrowths. So again, walled ingrowths, right, so it creates these long finger-like projections which increase surface area, which improves it makes more efficient transfer between the embryo and the maternal tissue. Okay, and again, this is why they're called embryophytes, right? They have an embryo, which is dependent on the maternal tissue, and it obtains its nutrients through the placental transfer cells. So let's move on to the sporangia. Okay, so the sporangia, this shows an example of a moss. Okay, so the sporangia are going to be like those capsules, Okay, and inside the sporangia are going to be sporocytes. Sporocytes, C-Y-T-E-S. Whenever you say that, that means that's a cell. And again, this is going to be a diploid cell. Remember, the sporophyte is generated from that embryo, right? So the embryo is diploid. Okay, so this is a diploid structure. And it emerges from the gametophyte. And the gametophyte in moss is going to be dominant and longer lasting than the sporophyte. So here we can see the sporangium, and this is where the spores are produced. Like I said, looking a little bit closer at the sporangium, right? So this shows the whole capsule, okay? Inside the capsule, we can see there are spores. And like I said before, that it's the sporocytes, which are diploid, they're going to undergo meiosis to produce the spores. And here, the spores are going to be basically protected. So they have this wall. It's called the spore wall. And it's made out of that sporopollen. And remember, I told you that that is a protective polymer, which keeps it from drying out on land and protects it from those dry, harsh environments. Now, in terms of the gametangia, so the gametangia are where the gametes are produced, and we saw that during the life cycle, the description of the more specific life cycles of the fern and the moss. So this shows the liverwort. Okay, so this is an example of liverwort, and we can see that there's a difference between the structure of the gametophyte for the liverwort and between the male and female. Okay, so the female ones have these long projections, and then the male ones are more flat-like. Okay, so the female ones underneath these long projections are going to be where the archegonia are. And the male, it's more flat. On the top, you're going to see the openings for the antheridia. So the female structure has the archegonia, and the male structure has the antheridia. And again, this is where the gametes are produced. So there's a difference between gametes and spores. The gametes are also haploid. And then basically, as described in the life cycle, the sperm are going to have flagella. They're going to leave the antheridia, and then they're going to go find the egg and the archegonium, and that's where fertilization occurs. And the same thing occurs as in moss as the liverwort. Okay, so the liverworts and mosses are very closely related. They're both non-vascular plants. So then finally, the last characteristic that we're going to discuss is the apical meristem. So I kind of mentioned, remember, you were to look at the different stages of mitosis, looking at an onion root. Okay, so here we have a root, and you were to look in the meristematic region. So that's the region where there is lots of mitosis happening, because that's where the growth emerges from. Okay, so these regions are where the plants are continually undergoing mitosis, and this is how they're going to grow in length. So they can grow in length down from the root and also the shoot. Okay, so they can grow downward into the ground and upward against the force of gravity. Okay, eventually these cells once mitosis occurs, they're going to start to differentiate into the different tissue types. So let's talk about some additional derived traits. Now, these are not the 5 key traits in all plants. Some plants have these additional traits. However, other plants do not. Okay, so one of them is a cuticle. The cuticle is the waxing covering of the epidermis often found in leaves. And this, again, protects it from desiccation or drying out. Then there's stomata. Not all plants have stomata, however, most of them do. Stomata are specialized cells that open and close. And they open and close due to isotonic versus hypotonic. It's osmosis that allows them to open and close, because they fill with water, and then they're going to open up. They're going to swell up, and it opens up that space in between those specialized cells. And this allows for gas exchange. Okay, so this is how the oxygen is released from the cells, and carbon dioxide goes in. Then there's also a symbiotic relationship between plants at the root with a fungus. This is called mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae, you can see, is in a relationship with the roots of this plant right here. Now, fungi do not photosynthesize, right? So they can obtain nutrients from the plant because the plant can photosynthesize and produce sugars. So the fungus can, it's a mutualistic relationship, right? So the fungus can benefit from this. And then, of course, the plant also can as well, because the fungus can break down nutrients from the soil. And this is how the nutrients can be exchanged between the plant and the fungus at the root, at that relationship between the root of the plant and the fungus. So this is really a summary. These are the 5 key traits of land plants: alternation of generations. Remember the multicellular dependent embryos. That's why they're called embryophytes. The walled spores produced in the sporangia. So remember how we have the sporangia that produce the spores. We have the gametangia that produce the gametes, and then the apical meristems. And then there's some other key traits, right? So remember the cuticle, the stomata. And then some plants are in a symbiotic relationship with fungi, and these are called mycorrhizae. All right, so the next segment talks about the major groups of seedless plants. Okay, so these are plants without seeds.